everybody. Welcome to our coffee talk brought to you by the Active Girls Healthy Women program. My name is Hannah Hoke. I'm an executive and board member of the program and serve on the research subcommittee. The Coffee Talk series is part of the Active Girls Healthy Women program. Our vision is to empower girls and women to lead healthy lifestyles. We aim to achieve this vision through our mission, which is to advance girls and women's physical activity and health through research and outreach programming. In an effort to engage our community partners, such as yourselves, and strengthen our outreach programming, enhance our research efforts and collaboration, we have developed this series of coffee talks. So the primary goal of these talks are to disseminate evidence-based strategies and information to advance girls and women's physical activity and health. And we invite an expert to join us in an area that is relevant to our mission, vision, research, programming, or our community partners. And after their presentation, we ask our coffee talk presenters to give us a presentation. We will then engage in question and answer sessions or discussion. So please, we strongly encourage you to participate, ask these individuals questions, and further discuss the information that they're going to provide. I will be happy to read questions from the chat if you're more comfortable doing that, or you can feel free to come off mute. So at this time, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Abbie Smith-Ryan. She is going to be talking with us today. Her title of her presentation is Knowledge is Power, Empowering Women with Data-Driven Exercise and Nutrition Strategies for Life. She is a professor and associate chair for research in the Department of Exercise and Sports Science at the University of North Carolina and the director of the Applied Physiology Lab and co-director of the Human Performance Center. Her research focuses on exercise and nutrition interventions to improve body composition, cardiovascular health, and metabolic function for women across the lifespan. So thank you so much, Dr. Smith-Ryan, for joining us today. And the Zoom room is all yours.
All right. Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you all for joining us at lunchtime. I'm going to get my talk here shared, and you can let me know if you can see that. Go into presenter mode. You all can see that?
We can see slides. Yes, ma'am.
Awesome. Okay. So I probably put together too many slides with the idea of, I actually could have done this without slides, but visuals are nice. It's a topic that is so near and dear to me, and we are doing some really cool work, especially of topics that are quite contentious right now, which is a little silly to me, of like even training around the menstrual cycle or what happens in perimenopause. So I wanted to give some high-level thoughts on a number of topics with the idea of increasing some discussion. So I am going to go fast, not with this idea of giving you so much science, but really to think about what does the evidence say, and then how do we translate it in a way that's meaningful? Whoops, might be helpful. So I have a huge passion for this space, and so I was so happy to join you. This is my personal mission: inspire others through action and evidence to improve health and quality of life. And really over the last, I would say, 8 years, all of my work has really focused on female health. And that's where the data led me, not because I'm a woman, but because the data continued to show that women were responding differently and that we needed to explore that more. My work really focuses on body composition measurement. I'll give just a little insight on that today. Feasible and effective approaches to exercise. And so a lot of my early work was high intensity interval training, not because it's the only way, but because it's very time efficient, which can lend itself to very effective adaptations. We also look at progressive resistance training and high intensity resistance training. And then some form of nutrition or dietary supplements, not because dietary supplements are better than whole food, but when we think about optimizing nutrition around exercise, often it's hard to eat whole food. Some of those dietary ingredients can be really valuable. So I wanted to there's this, a lot of conversation about males and females, and really, I think in this space we should be talking about what we know, and women respond differently in different areas. There's a number of physiological domains that we know women are unique: brain, body composition, cardiovascular health, endocrine, gut health, irritable bowels, metabolism, and differences in performance and function. That doesn't mean we can't apply what we know from men, But I say this of like, if you work in any of these areas, sometimes it's taking a step back to say, should I do something different? Do I need to control for a different life stage or hormone status, or, should we explore it a little bit further? And then women do have a number of different life stages that are different, and that we have, some need for some additional data. And I'm going to give some of this. Like my work focuses some on the menstrual cycle and hormonal contraception, and in perimenopause. There are a number of really important spaces, but I say this of like there are a lot of areas of opportunity, and I hope that we as women and men continue to explore in this space. And then there's some interesting growing data, just how does exercise meet any of these needs or influence these domains? How does diet and exercise, and then even sleep. See if it'll work here. Okay, so I'm not going to give a basic here. I'm just going to give an overview of some key things to think about when we have our premenopause life stage, and it actually starts earlier. So usually average onset of menstruation is about 12 years old. We've even looked at what happens if you have delayed menarche, or what happens when those periods begin and stop. But there's a number of things that happens in premenopause, things related to important muscle growth and bone development, aspects related to heart rate and blood pressure, especially when we think about exercise. A topic that I think is really helpful and a good takeaway is the prevalence of dysmenorrhea or painful periods. If I was there in person, I would ask everyone to raise their hand if they had painful periods. The average response is usually, the stats say about 60 to 70% of women experience that. And I'll give you a note here later that there are some potential nutritional strategies, but this is a really important thing when we start to look at performance. I'll show you. Women can exercise regardless of the phase of the cycle they're in. But if you have painful periods, it might impact recovery or just overall qualitative feeling. There's sometimes other intangibles to consider. Then we have this perimenopause into postmenopause. Average onset of perimenopause, which is when periods become more variable, average onset is actually 42. And now working in this space, we see women even as early as 38 experiencing symptoms. And then the average onset of postmenopause in the US is 51. And I just wanted to show there's a number of physiological things that happen. And the other cool thing in the research space is that there's actually some really good data of postmenopausal females. There's a huge void of what happens in perimenopause, partly because as women, we rarely know that we're going through perimenopause. It's an understudied area, yet it's a huge area of opportunity where we can look at things like optimizing bone density, changes in body composition, but more importantly, how it impacts our cardiovascular health and even our mental health, things like changes in anxiety and depression. So what I wanted to start with is in this space, one of the hardest things to do, especially when studying women, is people might say, well, there's a menstrual cycle that, makes it harder to study women. But there's some cool technology. So first I wanted to say, like, one of the key reasons why we might look at women slightly different with different controls is because of the female hormones. So males have a bit more of a stable hormonal profile, and females have a monthly change, and then into perimenopause, it becomes even more variable. Does that make it more difficult to study them? Not necessarily, but potentially helpful to have a little bit more control. Whether that might be tracking menstrual cycles, and I'm going to show you some technology we use that you can use at home. But I do think it's really helpful for women to track the menstrual cycle so that every individual is different and to capture some of those changes. And then it also starts to help identify when those menstrual cycle changes maybe become irregular, either during perimenopause, or we look at a lot of female athletes, and a menstrual cycle. When I was a collegiate athlete, it was almost a badge of honor not to have a menstrual cycle, when in reality, we know it's actually a really good indicator of overall health. And so kind of to, really leverage the menses as a good thing, and to understand it's part of our normal physiology. So when we think about a normal menstrual cycle, I hate to say that because we actually don't know. I mean, we know what normal is, but it's quite variable. People have shorter cycles versus longer cycles, and it's characterized by some of these. This is a textbook menstrual cycle, what you see here. bleeding, which can range in days and flow. You have ovulation, which is when women tend to feel their best. And then luteal phase, when progesterone and estrogen are high. But this is what you might anticipate, and then you can control for it in a study if that's a primary outcome. But in reality, cycles are so very different. So I wanted to give you an example of how variable women's cycles are, and that these are still and can be normal. But the more we can start to capture it, even empowering women to start to feel, oh, like, yes, when my estrogen is high, I feel this way. Or a lot of people feel like they sleep better during ovulation or late follicular. How do those hormones align? It's not feasible to take daily blood draws, nor should you. But I think as we, be able to empower, there's some other technology I'll show you in a second. The other thing I want to say is, and there's a lot of conversation about what happens to exercise across the menstrual cycle or muscle ability to put on muscle, when in reality, women can outperform and perform regardless. Like you can break an Olympic record regardless of where you're at in your cycle. But there are some things that are happening, and this is very individual specific. And it does seem that potentially we might want to look at recovery or sleep or nutritional changes that might be individualized for a female to be able to maximize some of those performance effects and or sleep, for instance, or even things like recovery. So one example I'll give you, and I'm going to show you some data here in a second, there is some good data around hydration and thermoregulation, that in that luteal phase, there may be a greater risk for dehydration. And that's also the phase where women tend to hold fluid extracellularly, hold more of that fluid. So we use that physiological basis to explore something like creatine supplementation. Creatine supplementation works by bringing fluid from the extracellular space into the intracellular space. And really in women, when controlling for the menstrual cycle, it seemed to be most effective during that luteal phase by helping hold into that water intracellularly. And I'll show you that here in a second. So really helping us explore of, are there some different nutrition or exercise or recovery strategies that may help women different phases of the menstrual cycle? So then, does that hormonal influence impact exercise performance? Our group and several other groups have looked at this, and I think this is a good kind of summary of maybe, maybe not. Like in general, women are going to perform. Aerobic endurance performance may be slightly reduced. I don't think that I would say that. I mean, it really depends on the individual. Effect size is very trivial. Data is inconsistent. What we're seeing with a lot of our elite athletes too is that they will perform regardless, but there's a qualitative component that's really important. They tend to feel different in different phases of the cycle, which might be able to be addressed with things like sleep and nutrition and recovery. These are a couple papers over the last couple years that we started to explore this effect of exercise on anaerobic exercise or strength, as well as there's very little data on different types of hormonal contraception. And a couple interesting things is, one, performance is not reduced regardless of contraception or menstrual cycle. And this is consistent not just amongst our group, but others. And then it seems like there's a bit of a trend and a change of hormonal contraceptive use. There's a lot more empowerment and knowledge, but we still see that women actually feel like contraception can be helpful for some symptoms, things like reduced cramps, irregular periods, and mood swings. And so it's really important to realize that you would use a contraception for lots of different reasons, and there's also a lot of different types of hormonal contraception. And there's actually some potential benefits based on how we might perceive side effects. This is just a survey study that we did. The interesting thing also to point out is in individuals that are highly active versus moderately active, some of those symptoms may be more impactful if they're, have those reduced cramps. This is from some of our elite athletes that we've been working with. And what I wanted to just show is that they will perform. They're ready to perform. Some of our resting heart rate measures, some of the sleep and stress differences change across the cycle. And it's that qualitative component prior to performance that might change. And I say that because, it's great. You can perform, but might we want to think about some environmental conditions or think about maximizing our sleep and or things to help optimize our recovery when we're not just thinking about performance outcomes. And then should females train differently throughout the menstrual cycle? My response is no. We can do any type of training anytime. It is highly dependent on the individual. So we've done and approached some differences or looked at some different nutritional approaches that during, different phases of the cycle, you might, for instance, in the luteal phase, you might want a little bit more carbohydrate, maybe a little bit more protein, depending on the exercise volume, based on some of the protein oxidation. Or is it more related to menstrual cycle symptoms? So tackle the symptoms, and we should always be focusing on optimal intake of nutrition, sleep, stress, motivation, but dialing that in for each individual. On a mean level, most women can perform regardless, but there are some individuals that have bigger effects or more symptoms that you could maybe tackle. And at the minimum, you'd want to address, especially if we're talking about a strength coach, or on the opposite side, in a research scenario, if qualitatively a woman does not feel as well, that it might impact outcomes. Or then as a woman, if you're not feeling as well, you can always adjust your training. I would say that for a man too. And then this is a recent paper that my PhD student who's just graduating as a former strength and conditioning coach. And we tried to take a model of our traditional strength and conditioning periodization. Like if we were to try and increase strength, we would, have a basic mesocycle. But what if we were to consider the menstrual cycle and optimize? Like really in this luteal phase, would you want to do the highest volume? No, really, you would follow a linear periodization, potentially do lower volume, higher intensity, potentially based on some of that muscle protein turnover that we see in the luteal phase. So it's taking what we know about strength and conditioning, but also considering that we're working with a female versus a male, and some of those qualitative components that we often see, for instance, that greater fatigue, so that higher volume might not be as optimal, but that training intensity could still be high. So this is just a theory that we could start to bring those worlds together. And then, just the article covers, this is really talking about an elite level individual. Every day, I'm just lucky to exercise, not necessarily, control for my menstrual cycle. It really begins to talk about who are we working with? What are their symptoms? We don't need to make it more complicated, but if someone is not responding or is more sore or not seeing goals, like these are some things to consider. Okay, so then I wanted to show you this measurement. I think is pretty cool. So we use a couple at-home tools, and I want to show you. So even if we're bringing women into the lab, this is between females. So there's a lot of variability. This is showing daily estrogen versus daily progesterone, and two women can be quite different. We know that there's individual variability, and that makes sense. Can we still capture what phase they're in, and can we control for some of these hormones? The other part is within individual variability. So this is the same person, and you can see over 2 different cycles, there's a lot of variability in the amount of estrogen and when that peaks. So here you can see day 16 versus here is day 14, whether ovulation occurs or not. So a lot of these devices that we're leveraging were designed for fertility, but also really helpful to use at home to start to quantify and understand, okay, even when estrogen is high, is that impacting your sleep or recovery or vice versa? Or do you feel really good during different phases of the cycle? And then very valuable during the menopause transition because periods and ovulation are so inconsistent. Often you might get a single blood draw, but what does a single time point even mean when those hormones are so variable? And it gives that, beyond that one day. So let me show you an example here. So this is using an Aneto at-home device. Another one that we've used is UVA, and you can buy these at home. I think it's pretty interesting. So this is an example. It gives you estrogen, LH, FSH, and progesterone. And you can start to see potential ovulation, but also kind of the peaks and the valleys of those hormones. I also wanted, so this is a younger female, and this is work we're doing in collaboration with one of my former PhD students, Dr. Katie Hirsch at the University of South Carolina, trying to validate some of this urine hormones so that we can start to use it even in a clinic. So we start to know what that variability looks like and as a research tool. And then I wanted to show you, this is actually my data. And so as a mid 40-year-old, like you might go to the doctor and they'll say, oh, we don't need to take your hormones, or we'll do one. And I walked away with this thinking like, wow, my hormones are so low. No wonder I don't feel great. It gave me some empowerment to say, okay, well, what's causing that? And to have a little bit more empowerment to take some ownership in my healthcare. And more importantly, we are using these tools in the lab to help us identify, is a woman perimenopause, and how might it relate to some of their physiological outcomes. So some of these methodological advances help us, one, to include more women, so reducing some of those barriers, and empowering women on their health journey to say, like, here's actually what's happening, here's how I feel, and here's what the hormones look like, things that you might not, need or have to just rely on your physician for that. And so I wanted to give a funny story. A lot of my work revolves around body composition measurement. And early in my career, we were submitting a paper, like trying to create the most valid method for body composition measurement. And I had a reviewer that said, you can't use DEXA in women, it's not valid. And I thought to myself, like, I don't see why not. I also don't think there's any data to say that. So since then, we've also done, so this is in the early follicular phase, mid follicular phase, and then we've gone on to also look at the luteal phase. And actually, DEXA is the one device that is the least sensitive to changes in the menstrual cycle, meaning that if you are doing a study and including women, you actually don't need a control for the menstrual cycle if you're using DEXA. If you're using some other tools, things like body water, that will be a bit more sensitive to those changes in the menstrual cycle. So right there, reducing barriers to having so much control depending on when we want our females. Also really helpful if you're measuring body composition in the field, or for goals of making sure we know what's changing so we know that the values are actually real. And then from a clinical perspective, it's really important, not just to talk about, a lot of people think about body composition related to body fat, when in reality, it's really related to the muscle fat ratio. And that muscle should be this bigger conversation, especially for women, and that it is directly related to our cardiovascular disease risk, which we know increases in midlife. And so I think this is another empowering point of, most often us as women, we were taught to, exercise more and eat less, when in reality, we should be thinking about how do we put ourselves in an environment to support high quality muscle and muscle maintenance, which is less of a scarcity view. And muscle does seem to have a bigger impact on our overall health. That does not mean bodybuilding. That means, creating an environment to support muscle mass, and that can be related to overall health. So the data started to show us this as well. So I wanted to present a little bit of data. One component, we did this study with a group of very different body composition. So some of them were women in this third tertile who had bariatric surgery, down to a bit more leaner individuals, of how do we create some accurate energy expenditure estimations as a normal caloric goal. And we identified in this initial work was that fat mass also needed to be considered when looking at these energy expenditure calculations or estimations. And so just to give us a little bit of tangible takeaways here, if I were to use the Harris-Benedict equation in these women, it might recommend a starting point of 1,700 calories, but really using some of these adjusted equations, accounting for also fat mass, since we have fat mass within the muscle as well. A better caloric goal would be about 2,500 calories. And so creating an environment that can support lean mass and energy and overall metabolism, maybe some of our initial estimations for women need to be rethought out. Which leads me to this was data that we are just capturing. I wanted to share in perimenopause specific. There's a lot of question now. We know composition, and there's physiological changes that happen in perimenopause, typically an increase in fat mass and a decrease in muscle. But part of that is it energy expenditure related? And how do we estimate that? So this is from a sample of our perimenopausal women looking at if we estimated using indirect calorimetry energy expenditure and then really common estimates or equations for energy expenditure. Harris-Benedict is one that's often used, and you can see it's significantly different than our indirect calorimetry for these midlife women by about 100 calories, and you can see, Cunningham and DiLorenzo is even higher, whereas the Mifflin and Molnar equations are actually quite similar to indirect calorie equations. So my takeaway is if I'm a midlife woman or working with a midlife woman trying to establish initial nutrition recommendations, these estimate equations would be a much better option than some like a Harris-Benedict that you might start with. And so we can at least start with a better energy expenditure value. And I wanted to give just a little insight on premenopause and perimenopause data insights. So in premenopause, I think one of the key opportunities, not only for research, but also for practice, is this dysmenorrhea or painful period. So when we think about some of the causes as related to the blood volume shifts, some temperature regulation, often see an increase in cramping along with GI distress and potentially greater fatigue. Utilizing some electrolytes and omega-3 to support inflammation might be helpful. And then there's this little plan here, like I wish I could see who experiences painful periods, but it's really common, and most people utilize a lot of ibuprofen. And there's some initial data around using more of a omega-3 as an anti-inflammatory with some zinc and some magnesium and a lower dose aspirin to help with that more continual kind of regulation of dysmenorrhea. So this, I think, is a big impact potentially to explore even in future research, but something that can be translated. Another thing that we've looked at is nutrient timing. So this is a study we did a long time ago in young women to look at different types of exercise, so high intensity interval training, high intensity resistance training versus aerobic exercise. And we wanted to look, okay, well, what happens with those estimates, but also if we consume 25 grams of protein or carb before those exercises. Really, because when you think about going to exercise, you might grab a banana or you might fast, or should we be eating protein? And we looked at energy expenditure and respiratory exchange ratio, so fat utilization. Immediately post-exercise, there was no difference. Like immediately post-exercise, you're going to be burning a lot of calories, and it's going to be really high carbs based on this high intensity group. But what we did see is that the protein group resulted in significantly greater energy expenditure, 30 minutes post, 60 minutes post, and actually greater fat oxidation. Fat oxidation does not always mean fat loss, but it can be helpful over time. And so we thought, okay, this is pretty interesting of that if we do protein prior to exercise versus carbs, could it have a little bit of an impact, especially if body composition is our goal? So we had a follow-up study to this that combined pre-exercise nutrition versus post versus control in 43 resistance trained individuals. And you can see it was a little bit of carbs and protein. This was looking at pre and post with 6 weeks of high intensity resistance training on a number of outcomes. But I want to show you here. Here's our figure. So training volume was significantly lower in the post group. So if they consumed after, they were able to do a little less. There was no significant differences body composition, but was better. It was about a half a kilogram greater lean mass, a half a percent or about 1% or 2% less in fat mass, and a little bit greater strength. So not significant, but it was better. And then there was greater increases in energy expenditure in the pre and greater fat oxidation. So this is a big debate right now of you don't have to eat before, or you should eat after, or you could fast. And the best takeaway is that you might see a better impact if you eat prior to exercise. Now, I'm a person that I have a hard time eating before exercise because it hurts my gut. Does that mean all my training is lost? Absolutely not. But I do know that may behoove me to eat a couple hours prior to see that bigger impact on my training itself. And so then if you think about optimization, this little bit can potentially have a bigger impact over time. So I often ask a woman, are you eating anything before exercise? And if they say no, then I would suggest a little bit of protein could be helpful based on some of this early evidence. Do you have to? No, but it might be helpful, especially when we look at some of these outcomes. This is a different, but kind of along this same line, based on these data that are building upon each other. We looked at high intensity interval training, essential amino acids by themselves, and that combined. Looking at things like lean mass and muscle characteristics, so muscle size and quality. And over time, it does seem that HIIT combined with EAA, so essential amino acids or protein, had significantly better impact on lean mass and thigh lean mass. So again, is exercise by itself not good enough? Not necessarily, but especially in a time, for example, for a woman or a midlife woman where we might see greater changes in lean mass, these little changes or little alterations in our approach to training might be helpful to maximize muscle size and quality. And then some of our work I alluded to has looked at creatine, another hot topic here, and a little misconstrued, I think, in the media of like people are saying every woman should take creatine. There are benefits of creatine for males and females. This study we looked at, NHANES data, was an association study, but I think a couple interesting takeaways is that average daily intake for women was quite below kind of what we would anticipate, and the amount was lower as women got older. So you can see our older adults getting 9.2 grams per kilogram, when about the daily requirement should be about 13 milligrams per kilogram. And the creatine intake was associated with some of these normal menstrual cycles, lower rates of pelvic infection. It's not a cause and effect, but more of like, should we start to explore this? Are there different effects in women? This other study we did before the NHANES approach, and I alluded to this of could creatine impact exercise performance different for females? What we identified is when taking a loading dose in the follicular phase versus a loading dose in the luteal phase, creatine did help prevent some of the performance lost in the luteal phase. Would that tell me to go rush out and take creatine only in the luteal phase? No. But if you have someone that's maybe having a harder time performing, or you're seeing a decrease in recovery and performance, creatine may rescue that slightly. I think this part of the project was even more interesting. One of the reasons women don't want to take creatine is because of the potential weight gain. And what we saw here down in this bottom graph is this blue being creatine and this white being placebo. There was no differences in weight in the follicular, and there was about a half a pound increase in the luteal phase, obviously not controlling for that fluid change. So this is a pretty normal change without creatine. And then what we did see is that in that luteal phase, there was a difference, significant difference in the total body water, extracellular fluid, and intracellular fluid in the creatine only group. So I say that of like the next step of this study would to be look at, is there some potential on thermoregulation and heat stress potentially if we're able to hold on to some of that fluid intracellularly. The other thing is that if you have more fluid intracellularly, it does potentially help create an environment that's better for increasing muscle mass and recovery. So maybe more of an indirect effect on some of those outcomes. Okay, so then perimenopause, a couple nuggets here to look at. I also think this is so interesting when we look at the economic burden of menopause. And this study showed just menopause costs American women an estimated of 1.8 billion in lost working time per year, which I think is really important. To me, it's a takeaway of like women need help. We need to help them feel better. And even with more conversation about hormone therapy, things like exercise and nutrition are still a really important lifestyle component that will help these women. But what do those guidelines look like? I think that's where we need to come together. So one of the interesting things that stimulates a lot of talk is these changes in body composition in perimenopause. So this is a big study from the SWAN network, that over time there's a significant increase in fat mass and a lean mass lost. I used to think it was more of a linear response, Like as we get older, we gain fat and lose muscle. But what we see is that actually it's a bit more accelerated in that time around and up to postmenopause, and then it tends to level off. So then as a physiologist, I think to myself, well, what a perfect opportunity to intervene and to help prevent some of those dramatic changes. And so here is just some stats, and we've dived into this a little bit more to see what does it look like with more sophisticated measures. You can see a gain in fat mass and a loss of lean mass. But what's more important too is how this is associated with cardiovascular disease risk and how do we modulate that. So we started to look too at what are some other things that are happening and how do we modify this? So this was a study where we looked at pre, peri, and post women in a cross-sectional approach. And percent body fat, which includes both fat mass and lean mass, significantly accounted for the variance in total menopause symptoms, with that body fat predicting almost half of the variance in that total menopausal symptoms. Lean body mass had no significant effect, which we went against our hypothesis. I'll come back to that in a second. And then vigorous exercise predicted 16% of the variance. And so, for instance, higher vigorous exercise was lower total menopausal symptoms. This is not a cause and effect, but led us to start to think, are there some vasodilatory properties? Are there some adaptations from high intensity exercise that might help these women? And then even here, we looked at total lean body mass, and some of our other data started to help us ask questions. It's not just muscle mass, it's muscle quality. And then what we think the best way to describe muscle quality is, I always say, think about like a fillet versus a ribeye. A fillet is a high quality muscle, low fat infiltration, whereas a ribeye has more of that fatty infiltration. Our muscle quality changes as we age, and we really want to try and keep more of that fillet type of muscle, which may be more associated with lower menopausal symptoms, higher quality muscle, lower cardiovascular disease risk. And then here, I wanted to show you some of the other properties we found just supporting there does seem to be an increase in body fat, particularly around the abdomen, a decrease in lean mass and muscle quality. But what I want to point out is it's not linear. It really does seem to be this perimenopause, so that 42, arguably 38, up to 52, sometimes later, that might be the key window of opportunity or to really start to have prevent this loss or this change. We have since done some work on protein balance as well. So it seems in this midlife, women may also have a little bit earlier onset of anabolic resistance. So our inability to use some of those proteins. So potentially we might need more or being more cognizant about eating those proteins throughout the day. We've since done a 2-year follow-up, and we're seeing that still that change in muscle quality, which just speaks to lifestyle. The best way to maintain muscle quality is having that stimulus with some exercise and then obviously some appropriate nutrition. So I wanted to show this. We use DEXA a lot, not because it's a gold standard, but I wanted to give you this example. If you look here, this individual is measured in 2016 and then again in 2021. If they just went by weight, you can see their weight only went up by a pound or two. But when we look at their tissue, you can see their fat went up by about 20 pounds and their muscle went down by about 20 pounds. You can see they've also lost a pound of bone. So now this individual has a lot of bone. But so often people are stuck on the number of the scale, when in reality, we want to look at the quality of the tissue and help maintain that lean mass, and that bone is more directly related to health and quality of life versus the weight in itself, which just speaks to some measurement and to some support around how we modify that. Okay, so then the last couple slides here, and I can't wait to hear some questions. We are still trying to dial in of like, are women's muscle, particularly in perimenopause, really that different? And is it driven by hormones? Is it driven by environment? What is happening? And so we have a current study now that we're looking at most sophisticated methods of measurement. So MRI, PQCT, ultrasound, and then just DEXA. as well as this daily hormonal intake. So that what I showed you at the beginning of not only do we want to account for that single measurement time, but that 30-day, sometimes 60-day fluctuations in hormones in perimenopause, so early perimenopause and late perimenopause. What's happening to the muscle? So we use this Aneto device, and using estrogen and progesterone, we split it into like a high estrogen progesterone, which would be similar to an early perimenopause, and a low estrogen progesterone, which would be more late. And we continue to see a decrease in muscle volume and a change in muscle quality. So a really important takeaway is not women in this life stage are doomed, but we really need to target muscle size and muscle quality, which is really important of we don't need these women to do more exercise and eat less. We really need them to be fueled and to stimulate the muscle in a way that supports it over time, especially in this narrow age range that we start to see this change. It is potentially related to some hormonal changes. We also saw muscle quality. So it goes back to that ribeye. So actually, the greater the muscle quality, so think fillet, was associated with lower total menopausal symptoms, reduced psychological severity. We see a lot of changes in anxiety, depression, and cognition, and decreased anxiety severity. So again, as an approach to exercise, that does not mean it's a cure for all of these things, but there's a lot of indirect benefits of exercise when we think about anxiety, psychological health. But it seems that there's a direct connection too. If we can maintain muscle quality, it might be related to better experiences through perimenopause. And then lastly, wanted to show you part of this study that we're looking at is what happens in perimenopause if we leverage some of that nutrient timing work of eating protein versus placebo. In this case, it's water. So protein or fasted prior to high intensity exercise in perimenopause. This is very preliminary data that we're working on, but I wanted to share. So energy expenditure in the group that consumed protein, there is significantly greater calories expended right after exercise and 40 minutes after exercise when consuming protein. And then here, it wasn't significant, but there's more variability in RER, and we're also using a more invasive tool we just haven't analyzed yet. There's less or greater fat oxidation, a lower RQ, not significant, but this tells me it's following the same pattern of like we probably, if a woman is exercising to maximize body composition, particularly lean mass, it might be more optimal to have them eat some protein prior to exercise versus fasted, which seems like a silly debate. Just eat when you want to eat. But if we're trying to kind of optimize it, this might be something small to consider. And so then in summary, before we get to some questions, like there are a number of physiological outcomes that do differ between males and females. That doesn't mean it should alter dramatically our training, but we should start to ask questions of women do respond different. Is it, control for the menstrual cycle that we need to make, or are there symptoms that she's experiencing that you might need to modify some aspects? And muscle matters. If we can stop thinking about fat loss and really think about an environment that supports muscle, it seems to be a really good, impactful marker to think not only about menopausal symptoms, but also kind of links to overall health and quality of life. So then just to leave you with a joke, I think that, everyone's worried about what to do and what not to do, but we all need more water. And if you drink a lot more water, you'll be won't have to worry about everyone's drama. I think we're all trying to do our best, but wanted to give you a couple key takeaways and hopefully an ability to answer some questions. And research is not done by any individual. Big thanks to my team. Our shirts say Team Hot Flash. We like to support the women in this space and really trying to figure it out of things that are feasible, effective, and time efficient to help women feel a little bit better in this time frame. So thanks for listening and happy to answer some questions.